Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and welcome to the Post 33, Ignorance Studies. Think about some of the truly dreadful words and phrases that circulate in our culture. Stupid, fool, moron, dumb as a box of hammers. These words and phrases are used to signify our difference from other people. But further, those definitions and differences are used to demean others, to say that they are lesser to us. They're stupid, they're dumb, they're foolish, and not in the Shakespearean sense. In the last 10 years we have seen a debilitating rise in the labelling and judgment of others. So, for example, Donald Trump's critics described his supporters as, quote, a stupid person's idea of a smart person, end of quote. And then, of course, we had Hillary Clinton, who described the Trump supporters as deplorables. Okay. Then we have the climate change deniers. Then we have the anti-vaxxers. And yes, I understand that for those people who deny that human beings have had an impact, a negative impact on the environment, I understand that the people who deny that billions of people through history have survived because of vaccines and millions of people just in the last 2 years are living because of a vaccine. I understand that those groups and the response to them can create anger, hatred, ridicule and name-calling. I understand the rage. I understand the anger. But the question for us, colleagues, is where do we put that rage? Where do we put that anger? And remember that this anger, this rage, demeans others. It demeans people, even if their belief systems are seen to be irrational or unstable or a bit of a worry or just bizarre. But it's very easy to slide from a commentary on a person's views to a commentary on a person. So what happens is we go, a stupid idea suddenly emerges from a stupid person. Now, I despise all of these words. As someone who grew up with an impairment and a disability, I understand the labelling of stupid, disabled, moron. I really get that, and the long-term impact of those words when they're applied to a human. Because these words hurt. They maim. And I would argue that these words intensify the political polarity that we are managing, or not managing, at the moment. So for me, the goal of any political organisation, political movement, indeed the goal of life, the goal of humanity, is to ensure that we continue to have conversations with other citizens. We offer arguments, we listen to arguments, we make the case. And we try, I know desperately at times, to try and build consensus. Now, this century has shown us, I think, that governments and citizens around the world have failed to develop that consensus of ideas. And we have failed to develop this consensus around ideas, and can I say pretty straightforward ideas, like the care of children, the care of the elderly, health and education provision, managing waste in our environment. Now, these are pretty straightforward issues, but the conflicts around these pretty straightforward issues, caring for old people, caring for children, the conflicts around these sorts of issues are hot and disempowering to so many before we get to issues like reproductive rights, taxation, migration, and the regulation of finance capitalism and real estate capitalism. So we're yet to address, at this point in the post, these phrases that have been used for the last 20 years over and over again without much meaning. And of course, these phrases are, why are we focusing on freedom of speech rather than the freedom to read? Why are we focusing on freedom of speech rather than the freedom to listen? And why does the phrase cancel culture circulate rather than questioning the originating point, which is, why do some human beings want to demean and label and hurt others? Why are our foundational debates in the culture at the moment being configured in this way? And what can we do about it? So, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, all of those groups can be blamed, and they're easy to blame. And scholars and citizens can continue to marginalise fellow citizens involved in the January 6 uprising, or the Freedom Convoy in Canada, or the occupation of Wellington around the Parliament buildings in Aotearoa, New Zealand earlier this year, 2022. So those groups can be labelled crazy, stupid, bizarre, out of their minds, out of control. But that's not the point. That's not helping us. We need to understand why these events have happened and why particular citizens have disconnected from communication and community and consensus. So we need to find something new. And so what we as scholars, we as citizens have to do is stop the name calling, stop the divisiveness, to try once more to build relationships, build communication, build consensus, so that judgments about behaviours do not blur or merge into judgments about people. Now, remarkably, during this very difficult decade, and let's be honest, really a couple of difficult decades for the environment, for citizenship, for rights, a new intellectual field has been gently and carefully growing, and it has very important benchmarks in the peer-reviewed literature. And the terms and the concepts used in this new and emerging field will transform citizenship, I would argue, and transform how we think about knowledge. So what I'm talking about is ignorance studies. Ignorance studies is an interdisciplinary field. It spans sociology, philosophy, history, anthropology, and remains a key lens through which to see science and technology studies. So while knowledge creation demands that we mesh epistemology, ontology, and methodology, we as scholars demean and ridicule and marginalise unproductive knowledges. How do we study unproductive knowledge systems, which we could describe as ignorance? So in other words, how do we research and study a lack of knowledge? What methodologies enable us to understand the positioning of the people that we study? So, a series of articles and books have emerged in this field, and I really do recommend to you as a starting point Matthias Gross and Lindsay McGooey's Routledge International Handbook of Ignorance Studies, published by Routledge, obviously, in 2022. The first edition of that book was published in 2015. I also recommend that to you, but the 2022 version obviously has COVID and is much more international in its approach. I also recommend Robert Proctor's Agnotology, The Making and Unmaking of Ignorance, published by Stanford University Press in 2008. And these books show the gift of bringing together economics, sociology, history, theology, cultural studies, along with memory studies, psychology, post-colonial theory, decision theory, jurisprudence, and also theology. So the gift of ignorance studies is that it provides a really focused matrix to bring together the natural sciences and the social sciences. So many of the interdisciplinarity between the natural sciences and the social sciences is too glib. The work hasn't been done. But in ignorance studies, the work is being done to build this relationship. Very powerful. So ignorance studies is also unfolding SSI, the sociology of scientific ignorance. That's been a very strong field for about 30, 40 years now. SSI, importantly, explored ignorance as something that is relevant to our understanding of knowledge rather than antithetical to it. So as you can see, these are important debates. Wow, these are important correctives. Ignorance may be used as a derogatory label, but it's much more difficult if we try to understand it and understand the knowledge within the ignorance. So when we research ignorance, we research the textured surface of power, the willful production of ignorance through, let's use examples, through dismissing the impact of tobacco on human health or climate change deniers. These movements can be tracked and studied historically. So researchers can now understand how alternative studies about smoking and about fossil fuels emerged. They were funded by, obviously, tobacco companies and oil companies, and then from these studies we can show how experts and public relations consultants who were paid shielded and masked particular facts and then summoned subcritical facts and rendered them incredibly important. That is what happened. So it's so much more difficult, though, to understand ignorance in our hot and really saturated present. You know, we're living in bizarre times of, January 6th and the shaman bless. We've got that freedom convoy, what a phrase in and of itself. And of course, the occupation of central Wellington. Okay? So what is going on here? Hot, it's everywhere, it's a problem. What's going on? Ignorance reveals the relationship between information and power. So knowledge is produced by dominant groups. Therefore, agnotology, the study of ignorance, allows researchers to understand how ignorance is deployed as resistance and as refusal. Ignorance is a refusal to conform, a refusal to agree, a refusal to believe expertise and to gain literacy, to participate in particular debates. So ignorance is based in fear. And can I say it's often a very justifiable fear of sickness, of death, of poverty, of homelessness. But ignorance, sadly, allows unjust power structures to be maintained. For example, an ignorance of slavery, an ignorance of the history of slavery has created and perpetuated a fear of black men. And that fear of black men survives to this day through racial profiling. And so therefore the phrase Black Lives Matter was summoned for many reasons. One was to counter ignorance, to create space for new consciousness, new discussions. So Black Lives Matter created a new space for new consciousness, new knowledge systems, confirming that black citizens deserve the right to live in peace and kindness and without conflict, and to live beyond, to transcend the fears of white citizens. So the fears and anxieties of white citizens are powerful, and they are sustained through an ignorance of history, particularly the history of slavery and colonisation. So Donald Trump was able to deploy nationalism, xenophobia, and fear, inciting violence while validating law and order. Remarkable. So Donald Trump was voted into office by white men and white women, many maintaining evangelical Christian belief systems and who had not completed a 4-year university degree. Okay, so those citizens had not been granted the gift and the opportunity and the benefit of extended formal education and the disciplinary literacies that we gain through a degree. So without disciplinary literacy, fear dominates footnotes. Fear is cement for reason, for thinking, for empathy, and for compassion. So what happens is, through this fear-fueled ignorance, a large minority of citizens vote against their interests. This is remarkable. So to provide one example for you, Brandy Johnson stated that, quote, while farmers mostly voted for Donald Trump, much of his platform was not favourable to agriculture, end of quote. So you can see this is remarkable, this is odd, because we live in selfish times. We live in self-absorbed times, and yet a group of people are not voting in their selfish interests. Wow. But of course, what ignorance produces is a fear of outsiders. And this fear of outsiders often transcends even self-interest. And this fear means that citizens voted for and supported people who used words like individualism, freedom, and choice. Now, this is the important bit. Most of the population in every nation around the world, most of the population loses money, loses support, loses services while validating the freedom of the few to choose their individuality. You see, the majority, most of the population of the world, gains from a commitment to public health, public education, public libraries, and the regulation of banking and the housing market. But the paradoxical nature of ignorance in our time is that a large minority of citizens are valuing choice and individuality and freedom when they actually possess none of these characteristics. So the reason that ignorance now has become so incredibly visible and is such a public policy problem, and of course why ignorance studies is now this burgeoning new field in the last couple of years, is because of the pandemic. The pandemic marked out particular bodies as bodies of fear, and social distancing resulted in social dislocation. The great failure of the pandemic is that public health authorities did not manage the fear. And without the management of fear, life-saving information could not find an audience and could not enable the development of literacy. You see, public health initiatives must always have an information literacy component to them. You see, any new information must always be grafted to already existing information for it to make sense, for it to have meaning. And if the new information doesn't fit into the already existing information and context, then it's not going to be believed. And so confusion and disbelief and anger and disconnection results. So there is peace and there is safety in ignorance. We need to understand that. As Robert Grafe has confirmed, quote, losing ignorance can be discomforting when it entails the insulating comfort of not knowing. End of quote. The insulating comfort of not knowing. So the decision to summon an information literacy scaffold, the decision we all make to learn means that we are moving from ignorance to knowledge. But that is an incredibly courageous step. And it's so courageous because moving from ignorance to knowledge is often a disempowering step. You see, a pandemic is a frightening context because it inhibits change. Because of the fear, it blocks us from gathering new information and new literacies. So ignorance can be benign, and certainly it can be completely understandable. But when deployed as a weapon against experts, academics, researchers, intellectuals, it can not only block innovation, it blocks survival. Ignorance is the contagion, and anti-intellectualism remains the carrier. While it's very easy to label and ridicule and demean and bully the ignorant, the foolish, the stupid, the morons, and use these sort of dreadful phrases, those of us who work in universities have to look in the mirror and recognise that we have failed. We have failed because we have enabled grade inflation, we have confused standards with standardisation, and we have muddled up research metrics and research quality. Our universities are in a really sick state at the moment. The widening participation agenda was and is an incredibly noble goal. Higher education can and must benefit the many, not the few. But the problem is this widening participation policy was not matched with public funding to enable widening participation, and it wasn't matched by andragogical innovation, so improvements in teaching and learning in our universities. So what we need, therefore, is research into ignorance, agnotology. So with this study, academics will start to understand why, through our lives, education is so often miseducation. And Gulu investigated 3 types of ignorance: native ignorance, passive ignorance, and active ignorance. And can I just state as an editorial point here, the phrase native ignorance worries me a lot about the adjective. I think probably organic ignorance is better, so I acknowledge that is a problematic word and phrase. But the model, I think, is an important one and can be revised in a more positive way. But let's go to native ignorance. Organic ignorance is the absence of knowledge in children and young people. Passive ignorance emerges when we limit what we know, such as selecting one subject over another in school or in universities, selecting one degree over another, or deciding I'm going to read this book rather than that book. That's passive ignorance. Active ignorance is forged from neither naivete or passivity, but requires the construction, the maintenance, and the regulation of ignorance. Really interesting. So as shown by the legendary Kevin Elliott, universities and their governing bodies are involved in both active and passive ignorance through selecting to fund some disciplines and not others, some research areas and not others, marginalising some scholarly approaches, and blinkering the framing of particular research questions. What are valuable research questions that will be answered? And of course, that ignores a whole series of research questions that may create some pretty uncomfortable answers. Now, Kevin Elliott described these processes as, quote, ignorance-generating strategies, end of quote. Wow. Resulting in a taxonomy of ignorance. So the relationship between living and learning is the key matrix of our lives. It really is the crucial discussion. So let's get into this. So identity politics, which is often on the left, but identity politics and the alt-right are locked into this tug of war at the moment about the empowered I. Let me explain what I mean about the empowered I. Our culture is really based on who has the right to tell their story without critique. And that's why all this stuff about cancel culture and freedom of speech is emerging. All of this is about the right to talk about the I without critique. The problem is that individuality, competition and identity politics have shredded the self, grated the surface of the skin of the self. And that's led to selfish politics and fear, and therefore the blocking of the movement from me to we. Ignorance is socially constructed, it's institutionally enforced. Ignorance has a context, delusions have a context, and context determines what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, what is bizarre, and what is reasonable. So this means that convictions are questioned, truths are doubted, and when truths are doubted in this way, those who maintain those truths are called stupid, or they're abused, or they're bullied. And this is why ignorance studies remains the interdisciplinary paradigm to move us beyond this mess, to understand the last decade and make sure that the fights over toilet paper, whether or not to wear masks, whether or not you have the right to be unvaccinated, to try and make sure these debates do not return. There are personal benefits in not knowing. I understand that. There are personal benefits in performing a lack of knowledge. We're not challenged through our life. If we're ignorant, we're not challenged too much. We're not challenged in our context. If we maintain ignorance, we can just move through life in our bubble and never have to be questioned or challenged. So for those of us who are researchers, we've got some clear challenges in front of us, colleagues. How do we confirm our expertise that requires that we log the ignorance of others? How do we do that with respect? How do we disseminate our research in a way that it's not dismissed? How do we value and validate ignorance while enabling the information literacy to transcend it? This is the trick. This is the trick of research dissemination. Valuing the life, the experience of citizens, while providing knowledge that may challenge that life and that experience. Ignorance is deployed as a policy strategy by dominant groups to maintain their economic and their epistemological position. To put my argument another way, the issue is not what we know. The issue is who is allowed to know. Abajirai described in 1986, quote, the social life of policies. End of quote. Great phrase, great argument. We need to return there, I would argue. Because Abajirai recognises that governments are reliant on ignorance, particularly in security and in defence planning. And that's why attacks on whistleblowers confirm that we need the empowered need, we need the repression of information to sustain power relationships. That's why whistleblowers are treated so badly, because they're providing information outside of the empowered. Therefore, ignorance studies has found its time, and it takes courage, compassion, rigour, decency and gumption from researchers to intervene in this incredibly toxic environment. Our present is marinated by death and disease and sickness and ignorance. It's up to scholars to try and provide a context for understanding, a context for literacy development, a path from information to knowledge, from experience to expertise. COVID showed the unproductive, inaccurate and ignorant binary opposition of health and economics. A ridiculous binary opposition. Imagine choosing between health and economics. And millions of people around the world died because particular national governments configured the health versus the economy binary. There are profound consequences socially, economically, politically, when we start to sever or even muck up a bit the relationship between intention and outcome, goal and result, argument and evidence. This severing of intention and outcome grows from ignorance, but it produces irrationality. All those demonstrations against masks, social distancing, against vaccines, they normalised harm and they normalised risk. The blame culture that resulted of migrants, of refugees, of the left, of China, of North Korea, of climate change, of feminists, of the trans community, all of that blame culture was a mobilised political strategy to avoid a recognition of the cost of marginalising regulation, marginalising governance and marginalising public policy over decades. So in this type of environment, the role of a university changes. The injustices in our higher education system, like in our population, are increasing. The richer universities are getting richer, and the poorer universities that have committed to first in family students, women, students with an impairment or a disability, Indigenous, First Nation students, migrant students, refugee students, older students, they're losing their economic potential to provide these alternative educational pathways. So we as researchers require something new. We require new, engaged, passionate strategies. We need to re-enter the debate and argue for the public good rather than private greed. Ignorance studies is the foundation of our next moment in intellectual history. I wish you love, light and peace. Tea out.